Great. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the March Blockchain at UBC Monthly Research Talk. Very delighted today to have our speaker with us, Dr. Oriol Caudevilla. And Dr. Caudevilla is with the central bank. Oh, just a second, Dr. Caudevilla, I'm looking for your, I have your description of your talk, which is going to be on CBDCs, the pilot test that you're doing in Japan and Korea, and that you worked on these over the past several years with the Chinese government as well. So I would just like to, without further ado, turn it over to you to introduce yourself more effectively than I have and introduce us to your talk and take us forward through this really interesting discussion. So thank you very much for being here with us. Sorry that I have misplaced your CV, but
no
welcome.
problem. Well, thank you very much for having me today. It's my pleasure to be talking to all of you about this fascinating topic. It's a quite new topic, but very, very current nonetheless. And I mean, everyone seems to be talking about this. So I'm going to try to provide you with a brief overview of this topic of central bank digital currencies in Asia. I'm going to talk around like 45 to 50 minutes. And at the end, we can have like some Q&A session. But still, if you feel like you need to ask me something and you don't want to wait until the end, you may feel free to interrupt me and talk. I mean, the idea is to make it as interactive as possible. So without further ado, let me start my session. I'm going to talk, as I said before, about CBDCs in Asia. And I'm going to go through the main projects in that continent, even though, as you can imagine, of course, most of my focus is going to be on China. First of all, because China is the area, is a place in the world where like I spend most time because I'm living in Hong Kong. And aside from that, because China's CBDC, the Digital Yuan, is the most advanced project, not only in Asia actually, but in the whole world. Leaving aside the case of the Bahamas, which I'm going to mention later, but when it comes to major economies, China is the most advanced one. So I'm going to start briefly by introducing this topic and myself, but I'm going to spend too much time talking about myself. Then I'm going to talk about CBDCs in general. I know that most of you must already know this concept, but still I feel like it is important to try to, well, to make some remarks about what CBDCs are and what CBDCs are not, because it's quite common to find even on the media some kind of misconceptions and mistakes about this topic. So I think it's important to bring some light to this issue. Then I'm going to go through the main CBDC projects all over the world to see their status, but it's going to be very brief. I'm going to proceed then by analyzing the Digital Yuan, which, as I said, is going to be probably the most important part of my talk. And then I'm going to analyze a couple more of projects in Asia, which are the tests in Korea and Japan, and the Project Aber between the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates and the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia. So this is pretty much the index of my session. About myself, well, I'm not going to dwell on that part for much longer. Basically, as Victoria said before, I'm currently working as a fintech advisor and management strategy consultant. But aside from that, I also enjoy giving talks and writing articles because I studied a PhD as well. So that's why, even though I'm not working in academia full time, I still enjoy doing these kind of things and trying to share my limited knowledge to as many people as possible. When it comes to my knowledge on CBDCs, well, I'd say that I've been doing research on the Digital Yuan for quite a while. And aside from my research in Asia, I also joined the Digital Euro Association in December, which is an association whose goal is well, to try to study CBDCs throughout the world, but especially digital euro. In my case, I'm trying to bring them with my expertise from Asia, to try to help them see how things are done in Asia and how they could be done in Europe. And in that regard, I know that in Canada, well, the Bank of Canada is also studying and working on the future on their future CBDC, the digital Canadian dollar. So well, I think it's important now to talk about this topic in Canada as well. About this topic, well, it's pretty much what I said before. I'm going to analyze the current status and opportunities offered by Digital Yuan in China, as well as the other projects that I mentioned before, but I'm not going to dwell on this for much longer. Let me start by talking about CBDCs. So, what's central bank money? I think we need to start like from the very beginning. A CBDC is central bank money, and central bank money is a legal tender issued by a central bank. It represents a claim against that central bank. So, I mean, every time you use a US dollar, Canadian dollar, euro, yuan, whatever currency you're using, you are using central bank money because that one is used by you, but it's issued by each respective central bank, and it's actually legal tender. So that's central bank money. So a CBDC is nothing else but the digital version of that central bank money. In other words, for example, digital yuan is going to be nothing else but a digital version of the yuan. The digital euro is going to be a digital version of the euro. It's nothing else but that. But at the same time, even though it sounds like very simple, it's not actually that simple, because whilst traditional coins and notes are not programmable because they are physical, but they cannot be programmed to fulfill some purposes. CBDCs are virtual, are digital, which means that they are programmable. Or in other words, central banks can add or remove certain features from CBDCs. And it's important to keep that part in mind, because that part is very different, of course, from what we are used to, well, to have, until now, which is like traditional coins and notes. There are two types of CBDCs, but I'm not going to dwell on this part for much longer. Basically, it's important for you to remember that there are the so-called wholesale CBDCs, which are designed to facilitate a more efficient interbank clearing between the central clearing operations between the central bank and its member banks. And then we find the retail CBDCs, which are available to be used by the public at large. And those would be like the equivalent to any bank note. Well, as I said before, CBDCs, and it's easy to see that based on its name, central bank digital currencies, are nothing else, as I said, but the digital version of the currencies that we already used. So the fact of being digital are a basic feature for CBDCs, as you can see on this slide. And the other basic feature is also related to the fact that CBDCs are central bank money. And this is the fact that CBDCs represent a liability against a central bank. So, I mean, these two features are like compulsory for a CBDC, but aside from those, there are some optional features that can be added depending on each central bank's interests, which are those that you can see here below, but I'm going to stop much longer on those because I want to finish everything on time. This one is important because there are possible motivations behind CBDCs. It's important for you to bear in mind that not every CBDC is going to be the same as the other one. So in other words, the digital yuan is not going to be the same as the digital euro. I mean, aside from being different currencies, but aside from that, the digital yuan doesn't necessarily need to look the same as the future digital euro or the future digital Canadian dollar. And this is so because aside from the technical features that can be added and designed differently, aside from that, the rationale behind its central bank might and will actually be different. In some cases, let me put it this way, CBDCs have these possible motivations, which are to replace physical banknotes, this one makes much more sense now during the pandemic, because people would like to avoid touching like physical coins and notes. So this reason might be like a strong one now during the pandemic, but there are much more deeper reasons, in my opinion, such as, for example, CBDCs as a monetary policy tool, CBDCs as a tool to improve financial stability, CBDCs as a way to promote financial inclusion, CBDCs as a way to fight financial crime. So it's going to depend, as I said before, on each central bank's policies and interests to see which one of those reasons is like more important to them. For example, in my opinion, in some countries like, for example, India or Indonesia, whose amount of underbanked people is so high, developing a CBDC to try to include as many more people as possible in their financial system would be basic for them. No? So maybe in that case, if India eventually deploys a digital rupee, they're going to do so basically to promote financial inclusion. Whereas, for example, the case of the digital yuan in China is different. In my opinion, China is trying to develop and eventually deploy next year its digital yuan to promote the use of the RMB for cross-border payments. So as you can see, the rationale behind central bank may be quite different. CBDCs should enable cheap, secure, and real-time transactions and should be accessible without a bank account. Aside from that, I think there are two very important distinctions to make on this slide. The first one is not included in here, but I'm going to start with that one. So basically, you may be wondering if every time I get paid every month, I get paid like let's put this way, virtually or digitally, because you don't actually see that money. I mean, no one goes to your office and pays you like in cash. No, you see. I mean, that salary is paid to your bank account via transaction digitally. So if you don't physically see that money, if then you make a bank transfer or use your credit card and you don't see that money physically either, aren't we all using already like digital currencies? Because it might appear so at first sight, but the answer is we are not using CBDCs. I mean, how is what I said different from CBDCs? Well, I mean, the answer is actually pretty simple. While real central bank money is a component of the monetary base and therefore a claim against the central bank, this kind of digital transactions that we already make are nothing else but debits and credits, or if you want, pluses and minuses between two different providers, the banks and the payments company. So even though you may be using Canadian dollars to get paid, and then you may be using your credit card to make payment without seeing physically that Canadian dollar, you are not using a CBDC now. You are just using the Canadian dollar digitally, but it's not a CBDC. So I hope I made myself clear. And aside from that, there's also a very common misconception, which is to consider CBDCs as cryptocurrencies. CBDCs are not cryptocurrencies. Actually, rationale behind both is the opposite. CBDCs, as I said before, are central bank money. Being central bank money means that they are legal tender. It means that they are, well, to some extent, centralized and controlled, because that's the idea behind central bank money. Whereas cryptocurrencies are precisely the opposite in that sense. Cryptocurrencies are part of this movement known as DeFi, decentralized finance. So cryptocurrencies were born, they are designed to precisely support that kind of operations that you don't want to have like that much controlled, to put it this way. So that's why the rationale behind both is actually the opposite. And aside from that, I think there's also another very important distinction to make. A CBDC is legal tender, and I know I said that before, but I need to stress that out. Whereas cryptocurrencies are digital assets. But until today, it's not impossible, but it's not common to be able to use cryptocurrencies to make any normal payment. I mean, you cannot go to the bakery or most places and use cryptocurrencies to pay, even though this is changing, because you know that PayPal is accepting cryptos now in the US, and MasterCard is going to support cryptocurrencies as well. So this might be changing, but till today, there's a clear difference between both in that sense as well. It doesn't mean, though, that CBDCs and cryptocurrencies may not have some similarities, because they do. technically speaking, CBDCs get some parts from cryptocurrencies. For example, when we talk about the digital yuan has some features which are typical from crypto, such as, for example, the use of both online and hardware wallets, or also the use of a two-key architecture to secure transactions. And those are technical features from cryptocurrencies. Pretty much the same idea when we talk about blockchain technology. CBDCs don't need necessarily to use blockchain, but it might be compatible and useful for them to use this technology, even though they don't have to. When it comes, for example, to China's digital yuan, which, as I said, is the most advanced case, so this is why I keep talking about the digital yuan all the time, it's going to be operating through what we call a two-tier structure, in which the People's Bank of China is going to issue the CBDC to the commercial banks. This is like level 1, without using blockchain. But then in the second level, those commercial banks are going to issue the digital yuan to the public, to the whole of the citizens, through blockchain. So if we ask, does the digital yuan use blockchain or not? Well, the answer would be yes and no, just partial. On this slide, you can see how blockchain works, but I assume that most of you already know that, so I'm not going to stop on this one for much longer. Just to remark quickly that blockchain is a technology that goes much beyond cryptocurrencies. Even though blockchain was created not to support Bitcoin, created by that person whose real identity no one knows, no Satoshi Nakamoto, etc., etc. Blockchain can right now be used in many more areas, and I know all of you know that already, but it's important to stress that out as well. Now, in blockchain is basic, for example, in those new trade finance platforms. It can be used for smart contracts, for insurance, video games, healthcare. So yeah, I think it's important to remark that as well, that blockchain underpins the operations of many more things than just cryptocurrencies. When it comes to CBDCs and blockchain, and to finish this part, China created this blockchain-based service network, BSN, which aims to support future CBDCs from multiple countries. But I'm going to stop on this part much more. You can see on here two screenshots from the wallet apps which Chinese citizens are going to use to use the digital yuan. As you can see, those wallet apps look quite similar to some crypto trading platforms, etc. This one that you can see here is actually the one that was designed by the Agricultural Bank of China, which was the first one that China started to use as part of their tests last year in April and May. So I saw there was a question before. No, there isn't. Okay. So moving forward, I'm going to talk now briefly about CBDCs around the world. According to a report published by the Bank of International Settlements last January 2020, 80% of central banks in the world are already working on CBDCs. When I say working on, it doesn't mean that they are testing their CBDCs like China is doing. Work on, in that case, means something as basic, perhaps, as doing some basic and initial research, etc. So it goes from that research to where China is now, which is much more advanced, which is like a proper and advanced test. So 80% of the central banks are, to some extent, working on CBDCs. And we expect this number to keep growing. You can see some projects in there, but I'm not going to stop there. And nevertheless, even though, as I said before, most central banks are already working on this to some extent, Asia seems to be the place in the world where CBDCs are attracting much more interest. Because aside from China, many more Asian countries have shown interest in at least testing their CBDCs. We can include in that list Thailand, Philippines, Cambodia, Vietnam, Japan and Korea, of course, of which I'm going to talk later. Also countries in the Middle East like United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Even Hong Kong is going to test the digital yuan, but it's going to test as well another CBDC project which used to be called Internon Lion Rock, but now it's been renamed, and it's now it includes the Central Bank of Hong Kong, which is the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Central Bank of Thailand, the People's Bank of China, as well as the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates. So it's a four-side project. So finally, I'm going to start talking about the digital yuan, which, as I said before, is maybe going to be like the most important part of my talk. Most important in the sense that it's the most advanced project in the world so far. And leaving aside, of course, as I said before, that case of the Bahamas. But the Bahamas, despite having deployed its own CBDC, the Sand Dollar, in October, are not what we can call like a major economy. So that's why I said before that when it comes to major economies, China is the most advanced one. Last April, after several years of work, actually after 6 years of research, China finally decided to start testing their central bank digital currency, the digital yuan. Before moving forward, I need to remind you that the digital yuan is known in several ways. Sometimes it's known as DCEP, which is actually the way that Chinese authorities prefer to call it. So that's why you're going to see many times the digital yuan referred to as DCEP, which stands for Digital Currency Electronic Payment. Sometimes you're going to see digital yuan referred to as eRMB or eCNY. So these four terms, digital yuan, DCP, eRMB, eCNY, are actually referring to the same idea. What I call in my talk digital yuan, but I mean you can see it written in many like different ways, but it's the same concept nonetheless. So those tests that I was mentioning before, which started last April, started initially in 4 mainland China cities, which are Shenzhen, Suzhou, Xiong'an, and Chengdu. And those tests are currently being extended to other areas, including the Greater Bay Area, which includes Hong Kong and Macau. So the thing about the digital yuan is what I said before. I mean, there are many ways to try to approach this topic, but some people might say that China is developing digital yuan to become a much more tech-oriented country, etc. But to me, this is not China's main rationale. Chinese people actually already are very reliant on electronic payments. Chinese people use WeChat Pay, Alipay, these kind of payment apps all the time. So it's not necessary for China to develop a digital yuan in order to encourage people to like stop using or use less physical coins and notes, because people are already quite used to making payments through these payment apps. If China, in my opinion, is trying to develop, and well, actually it's doing so, digital yuan, it's because China wants to try to convert some of the US dollar denominated international trade operations, transactions, and convert those into RMB denominated ones, which is going to be challenging because, as you know, the RMB is non-convertible. So well, it's a challenge. But I think it's quite clear that China is moving towards that direction because, and not only because I'm saying that, but mostly because of how China is acting. I mean, China is going to start testing digital yuan soon in Hong Kong, and those tests are going to be for cross-border transactions. Aside from that, China reached an agreement recently with SWIFT to try to internationalize the use of the digital yuan. So we are seeing many movements from the Chinese government that makes us think that my initial assumption that digital yuan was going to be mainly thought or designed to allow China to use it for cross-border payments is actually like an accurate thought. So going back to this slide. As I said before, the digital yuan is structured in this two-tier monetary system. I already mentioned that. So basically, the People's Bank of China, which is China's central bank, is going to issue the digital yuan to the commercial banks, like in the first level, and then those commercial banks are going to issue the digital yuan to the general public. Digital yuan has many advantages. It's going to allow to cut down money printing costs. This is an obvious one. It's also going to help China to try to tackle some issues that its financial system has, such as, for example, its shadow banking system, which has been a nightmare for China's financial system for these last 2 decades. It's also going to allow China to create an important soft power tool. I think to me that's maybe the key part. This idea of a soft power tool, of international transactions, etc. On this slide, you can see as well some more images of well, DCEP integrated into Alipay and the Bank of China app. Okay, I'm going to make here some brief references to China's shadow banking system, but very brief because I don't want to run out of time. The idea is that shadow banking is present worldwide. I mean, it's not just something that only exists in China. Shadow banking refers to those activities performed by the financial intermediaries involved in facilitating the creation of credit. Sometimes shadow banking is shadow banking products are offered by alternative companies or elements, like for example P2P platforms, etc. But other times it's as simple as the same traditional banks in mainland China, which offered some non-regulated products to the general public. Those non-regulated products are not illegal. This is why shadow banking is not per se illegal, but it's not non-regulated, which made it quite dangerous for China's financial stability. And one of the goals of Digital Yuan is to try to tackle this issue, as well as other issues that the Chinese financial system has. So how's Digital Yuan working so far? Well, I'm going to move to the most recent news. As I said before, last August, China's Ministry of Commerce announced that the tests would be extended to more areas aside from the 4 initial cities where it was initially tested. Those areas include Hong Kong and Macau. And I keep mentioning Hong Kong and Macau because, as you all know, Hong Kong and Macau are China's 2 special administrative regions, which means that testing the Digital Yuan in Hong Kong and Macau is going to allow China to test many more things than what they can do inside mainland China. Because in mainland China, I mean, of course, it's important for them to test it in as many cities as possible, etc. But it doesn't make much difference to test it in, let's say, Shenzhen or Shanghai. I mean, the difference is not huge. But when it comes to Hong Kong and Macau, the difference is bigger because it allows China to see how it would work, like, for example, for cross-border payments, because Hong Kong actually has its own currency, the Hong Kong dollar, which is pegged not to the yuan, but to the US dollar. So that's why I said that Hong Kong and Macau are so important for China in its tests right now. So the idea for China is to roll out its digital yuan throughout the country by the Winter Olympic Games next year in Beijing. And I think that is actually very feasible because so far the tests are going very well, so even better than expected. So that's why I think that China is actually is going to manage to roll it out as expected next year. So I'm not going to stop on each and every slide because I'm not going to finish if I do. But so basically, this one maybe is the most important one for you. Where are we now? As I said before, the idea that China has had these last few months has been to try to keep gradually increasing the amount of people and money involved in its tests. So that's why, as you can see here, China started to do those massive digital yuan giveaways, like a lottery, in Shenzhen last October, involving 50,000 people and 10 million RMB. And in January, just before the Lunar New Year, these tests involved, for example, in Chengdu, more than 250,000 people and more than 50 million RMB. So as you can see, China has been like gradually opening up its tests, and so far they've been, as I said before, very successful. So back to Hong Kong and Macau, this is pretty much a summary of what I said before. The tests in Hong Kong haven't started yet. They are finishing the technical preparations. But when they do, they are going to be the first time that China is testing the digital yuan for cross-border payments, which, as I said before, is basic, because to me that's China's main rationale behind the digital yuan. So, differences with existing payment apps. I think it's important to highlight a couple of things from this slide. Basically, DCEP is going to support offline payments. That's very important. And DCEP's transaction speed is also going to be much higher than, for example, that of Diem and Bitcoin. This graph is not actually dated because it refers to Diem as Libra, which used to be like the old name, but now it's Diem. But still, the ideas are pretty much the same right now. Another question that people, especially in China, when I was giving these kind of talks there in mainland China or Hong Kong, like, ask me all the time, is Digital Yuan going to replace those existing payment apps in China, which are like so powerful, like Alipay, WeChat Pay, etc., or are they going to coexist? Well, initially, I didn't even know it. I mean, I didn't know it myself because, I mean, it was hard to fathom what China wanted to do. It could be like China's idea or intention to try to compete with those and replace them, or not. But it looks like they're going to cooperate rather than compete. The idea for Beijing is to try to integrate the digital yuan within those private payment platforms like WeChat Pay and Alipay. So they're going to cooperate in that sense. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about the tests in Korea and Japan quickly as well. I'm going to focus mostly on the ones in Japan. It's mostly because I didn't have time otherwise to focus on both. South Korea and Japan are going to conduct their digital yuan tests this year, 2021. I think that even though both central banks would have done so eventually, the fact that China, which is their neighbor and well, the number one country in Asia, is so advanced, has somehow prompted these other countries to try to start their tests well, earlier than expected. No? So that's why we are going to see Japan and Korea starting their tests. I'm going to focus now, on, as I said, on Japan. Japan is going to test its digital yen this year in spring, actually, according to some news that I was reading earlier this morning, which I didn't add to my presentation, but they said it's going to be tested in spring. The thing is, unlike China, Japan is not planning on rolling out a digital yen anytime soon. Japan doesn't want to do so. Japan wants to do all the tests to make sure that it's going to be feasible for them to eventually roll out a digital yen someday in the future without committing themselves to doing so anytime soon. That's the idea. Actually, as you're going to see on the next slides, Japan said, well, actually, the Bank of Japan, which is Japan Central Bank, they said that the idea for them is that maybe roll out the digital yen in the future when they see that the decline of the use of physical coins and notes is like big, when they see a big decline. In that case, in that moment, they might consider rolling out the digital yen if those tests from this year go well. So that's the rationale, which, as you can see, is very different from that in China. But it makes sense, though, because people in Japan are not using that much those payments platforms such as WeChat Pay and Alipay. It's not that common in Japan. People in Japan still tend to be more reliant on using traditional coins and notes. Hence, the Bank of Japan's intention not to roll it out anytime soon. Also, I didn't mention that before for Digital Yuan, but Digital Yuan is going to be a retail CBDC, same as the digital yen. Okay, so I saw, is the audio working well now? Because I saw some.
Sorry, yes, it just keeps doing it intermittently. I just wanted to check if it was your speaker or your microphone.
Okay, let's see now. Okay, so let me continue. And you can see here like the three phases that the digital, the Bank of Japan is going to test its digital yen, but I'm not going to stop on each one of them for much longer. I just want you to know that those three phases exist, and that's all I think you need to know for now. And there are some expected functions and roles of this general purpose CBDC, the digital yen, which are summarized in the following way. So the idea is to introduce, if eventually rolled out, a payment instrument alongside cash. But that will only be done, as I said before, if there is a decline in cash circulation. So if there is no such decline, it might not be that clear that we eventually have this digital yen like properly rolled out anytime soon, at least. So this one is very technical, but I'm going to skip it. And even if the Bank of Japan were to issue a general purpose CBDC, it would still be appropriate, according to the Bank of Japan, to maintain a two-tiered system of central bank and the private sector. This means that that CBDC, the digital yen, would be issued indirectly through intermediaries, as you can see in here as well. So it wouldn't be issued directly by the central bank. That's the idea you need to get from here as well. And Bank of Japan as well, when they published that report in October, they established what the next steps should be or are going to be. And well, basically makes reference to what I said before. But and according to what Reuters published recently, a consortium of private banks and other companies and institutions in Japan have joined hands to develop this experiment to test the digital yen this year, which is going to be issued by the Bank of Japan, etc., as I mentioned before. This organization consists of more than 30 companies, including brokerage firms, telecommunication firms, etc. So these tests are actually going to be quite wide, despite the Bank of Japan not being interested in rolling it out anytime soon yet. But as I said before, Japanese people are still very much reliant on physical cash compared to others. So that's why you cannot be so sure that it's going to go as fast as digital yuan in China because of that. And aside from that, there are other projects in Asia. For example, former Hong Kong Monetary Authority Chief Norman Chantaklam proposed last year creating a new regional digital currency based on a basket of currencies consisting of the Hong Kong dollar, the China's yuan, the Japanese yen, and Korea's won. This was just an idea, a project. It's not like been done yet, but well, if done, it would be quite interesting as well. Because, so as you can see, there are many CBDC projects in Asia, and most of them actually intertwined. Like for example, the HKMA in Hong Kong, which is Hong Kong's de facto central bank, is working on testing digital yuan, but it's also working on this project formerly known as Internon Lion Rock, and it might be working in the future, perhaps, in this project proposed by Norman Chan, if eventually it's move forward. So that's why I said that Asia seems to be the place where there is like a much bigger interest in CBDCs from all the world. And before finishing my presentation, I'm going to talk briefly about one more project in Asia, but this one is not in East Asia, but in the Middle East, which is Asia still nonetheless. And this project is called Project Aber. And I think it's interesting to talk about this one, first of all, because well, we're talking about a different area, but also because unlike the two projects that I mentioned before, 2 or 3 if we count Korea, so unlike those 2-3 projects, this Project Aber involved testing a wholesale CBDC, not a retail CBDC. So that's why I think it's important to talk briefly about this one. Project Aber was started in early 2019, and the final report was published this last year, 2020, in November. Basically, the idea of Project Aber was to test whether it was feasible or not to issue a wholesale CBDC between the central banks of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. It was the main goal was to test, first of all, whether it was feasible or not to issue that wholesale CBDC, and secondly, whether it was feasible or not to do so by using blockchain. To make these tests more thorough, each country added 3 commercial banks to the pool of stakeholders. So that's why, as you can see here, this Project Aber ecosystem included the 2 central banks from both countries, as well as 3 commercial banks from each one of the 2 countries. So 6 in total: Riyadh, Al Rajhi, and Al Inma from Saudi Arabia, and Dubai Islamic, First Abu Dhabi, and ENBD from the United Arab Emirates. Basically, that report, as I said before, was published last November 30. And we are talking, I think that's like the most important part about this project that we need to keep in mind. We're talking about a wholesale CBDC because it was used only by central banks for interbanking clearing operations. Unlike, as I said before, for example, Digital Yuan, which is a retail CBDC designed to be used by the public, by all the citizens. Project Aber, the name Aber, it's also important to remark that part, is an Arabic word that means crossing boundaries. So it makes perfect sense to name this project Aber, because the idea was to cross a boundary, the boundary between the borders, between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The project confirmed two things. First of all, that issuing this cross-border dual issued currency was technically feasible. It was perfectly feasible. And also, second thing, that doing so by using blockchain was not only feasible, but also very recommendable. So I think, well, it's very important to remark these two things. And it's also very important to point out that according to the very own report published by both central banks less than 4 months ago, this project, what they saw as a result of doing these tests, exceeded their expectations. They didn't expect the results to be as good as they eventually were. Especially when it comes to the idea of using a DLT, a blockchain, to support the operations of such a wholesale CBDC. Those are the conclusions that I just summarized, so I'm not going to stop on this for much longer. And now I'm going to conclude my talk with some remarks, some brief remarks. So first of all, as I said before, if DCEP proves to be viable, which it will, this will mean that China is going to become the first major economy to introduce a CBDC. Many other countries are going to do the same. I said many other countries are going to follow China's lead, but this is not actually like completely accurate, because China didn't invent CBDCs. I mean, it's not like China invented the idea of CBDCs or anything like that. It's nothing like that. I mean, but China simply like went faster than others. That's all. Well, I mean, also because they are like more interested than others. I mean, we cannot like assume that China is going to go first because they've been like more diligent. It's not only just because of that. It's also because some other countries might not simply be that interested. Like, for example, in Europe, the European Central Bank is going to decide in April whether, well, Europe moves forward or not with the digital euro, which I think they will. But even if they do, it's going to take them from 2 to 5 years to eventually roll it out. But it doesn't mean that they didn't do so before, because they are simply much slower than China. It means that maybe for Europe it wasn't that such a priority to deploy a CBDC, because, as I said before, CBDCs may have like many different rationales or reasons behind them. They may serve like many different purposes. So that's why we don't need to assume that other countries are simply slower than China, and that's all. Maybe those other countries are simply like not that interested in rolling out a CBDC, and that's simply that. No. So that's why I said that it's going to depend on each central bank, on their interests, their policies. We cannot like talk about CBDCs as a general concept which has no variations. And yeah, what else? DCEP offers many opportunities to Hong Kong as well, and pretty much to the whole of China, and also for Japan and Korea. And I made a mention here as well to something that I didn't mention before, which is this free trade agreement known as RCEP, a regional comprehensive economic partnership, which was signed last November 15. This free trade agreement is, well, as you must have read on the media, one of like the biggest free trade agreements ever signed, and it includes China, Japan, Korea, all the ASEAN region countries, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam. It's going to create a huge free trade area, and to me, this China speeding up the signature of this treaty also responded to the intention of China to try to roll out the digital yuan in this free trade area created by the RCEP free trade agreement, to try to, as I said before, convert some of the US dollar denominated transactions into RMB denominated ones. So, and my final remarks, the Bank of Japan has no, as I said before, no plan to issue any CBDC, but the tests are still going to start this spring because Japan wants to test it, even though they admit that they are not quite likely going to roll out their digital yen anytime soon. So that's pretty much all. Thank you very much, all of you, for attending this talk, and thank you very much to UBC Blockchain for inviting me. And feel free, all of you, to connect with me on LinkedIn if you have like any further questions. And right now, of course, we still have like 15 or 20 minutes to go through any of your questions or concerns.
Yeah, thank you so much, Oriol, for your excellent presentation, giving us a fantastic overview of some of the latest developments. And I think we do have a question here in the Q&A. So from James Delorme, he is thanking you for your insightful presentation, which is wonderful, and as we do. Coming in late, but look for publications. The discussion of DCEPs and the context of indigenous traditional economies is his area of interest. And I'm wondering if you, in your studies, your research on CBDCs globally, if you have, if you've been looking at any developments at the, at the subnational or groups within geopolitical spaces or amongst indigenous people that might be relevant to James's question.
Well, not directly, but somewhat related to this, but not directly. I did some research on financial inclusion and CBDCs and virtual banking in Asia, especially in India. So one of the things that I, alongside some colleagues, were trying to tackle was to tackle this issue about underbanked or unbanked people in countries like India and Indonesia. So we try to see whether, in that case, a digital rupee might be useful to try to include as many people as possible in their financial system, especially when it came to people who didn't have that much access to the financial system, such as, for example, I mean, not only people living in remote areas, but also, women in certain countries, as well as perhaps Muslims in some areas of India where the Muslim population is lower. So we try to look at that as well. So it's not like 100% related to James's question, but I think it might have some relation. So I can share those with you as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. And so I'm going to invite others to post their questions to the Q&A or to the chat while we're waiting for some other questions to merge. I'll ask you, well, there's a couple of questions that had come up in my mind. So I'll start with one and then we'll see what other questions bubble up into the chat. But obviously, with this new form of currency, CBDCs, there's potentially a need for rethinking how we do financial stability monitoring and financial systemic risk monitoring. And I'm wondering if in the projects that you've looked at, if the central banks were at the same time as they were developing these digital currencies, if they were also looking at how they would monitor financial stability, if it was going to, for example, incorporate technological elements that wouldn't otherwise be there, or if there were extensions of existing approaches. So I'm curious about that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, in China they did that for sure, because I mean, as I said before, their financial system has been like kind of messy these last decades. And that makes sense because, I mean, we need to bear in mind that China used to be like a very closed country with a very closed economy until early in the 1980s. So I mean, China in 30-ish years became like, went from being a very closed and not that developed country to being like the number 2 economy in the world and soon the number 1. No? So growing that fast is of course great in many ways, but it has also like some challenges at times. In the case of China, well, I might say that maybe the two biggest issues that China is trying to tackle right now are shadow banking, which I mentioned before briefly, but I can mention now as well as some other issues related, for example, to stock markets. Those issues related to stock markets, I think they were dealt with already like a bit before digital yuan, but still China's financial system has been having like this big issue when it comes to debt, those huge amounts of debt, because their system, I mean, it's very different from ours in the West. It's a system where like the state has this huge amount of power and control. It's a system where like public companies are favored, to put it this way, I mean, compared to the private ones. And this has had some advantages, I guess, but many disadvantages as well. So that's why they have this huge debt, etc. And one of the main purposes behind the China's CBDC, the digital yuan, has been, of course, to try to tackle some issues. So, I mean, if we need to make like an order of priorities for China, to me, the first one would be what I said before, to try to increase the importance of the digital yuan in cross-border payments. But number two for me would be for China to try to control their financial system much more efficiently. Because even though when people think of China, they might be thinking of control, they didn't have that much control over their financial system. Because as I said before, for example, their shadow banking system was huge, much bigger than that of the US or Europe or Canada. And this is so because the big banks are public, and those public banks normally only lend money to big public companies. So for SMEs in China, for private SME companies, it was like pretty much impossible to have access to proper credit. So that's why these companies, they need to go to find other sources, and in most cases, those sources were some kind of other products sold to them by the very same public banks. Products, for example, like the WMPs, wealth management products, which are those non-regulated products, which in the end became quite a big challenge for China. It's true that China has managed to kind of control its shadow banking system even before digital yuan, because from 2017 onwards, the shadow banking system hasn't been such a big issue as the 5 previous years. But still, digital yuan is going to be of huge help, and this has actually been analyzed by the People's Bank of China, and it's in their minds as well. When it comes to other countries, I mean, I'm not so sure about each one of the other countries, because I said before, in some cases, like for example, Philippines, Thailand, Cambodia, their tests haven't even started, or like at the very initial stage. So it's hard to know for every case.
Right. Thank you. So we have another question that's come up in the chat here. Ben is asking, what do you think will happen with Bitcoin, and I guess maybe other cryptocurrencies after these countries and big banks adopt their own currencies? So how do you see the price being affected?
That's actually a question that I get asked like many times, and I think it's a very relevant one. Well, how to put it? CBDCs are not here to replace cryptocurrencies. Let me put it this way: CBDCs are here neither to replace cryptocurrencies nor to complement them. As I said before, both are like different realities. So, for example, if we look at China, we see that China has adopted like a very tough stance towards cryptocurrencies, towards privately issued cryptocurrencies. As you know, that trading platforms in China are like banned. You cannot like open a crypto trading platform in China. People can own Bitcoins, but you cannot use those platforms, etc. So China has decided to promote blockchain technology and promote its digital yuan, whilst at the same time they adopt this tough stance on cryptocurrencies. But it might be possible for another country to develop and promote its own CBDC, and at the same time be more open-minded towards cryptocurrencies. There is like no contradiction between both, because both are like actually like solving different needs, or are part of different realities. A CBDC, as I said before, is a central bank money, which means that it's legal tender, etc., issued by a central bank. So it's perfectly compatible for a country to issue its own CBDC, for people to use it, to use the central bank money virtually, and at the same time, that country allowing people to buy and sell cryptocurrencies, which are, as I said before, digital assets. And both ideas, both concepts are not like competing for the same niche, to put it this way. So we can either find countries allowing and promoting, promoting, I wouldn't say promoting, but allowing both to coexist, or we can find countries like China, which only allows its own CBDC to exist, but it's like being very much more harsh or tough on cryptocurrencies. So it's not like it's nothing that we can say it's not compatible or something like that.
Right. So there's still possible space, but it's going to, I guess, from your, from what I understand, your perspective on is that it's going to depend on the government's attitude and flexibility to allowing these cryptocurrencies to coexist with the CBDCs. Yeah. So we have another question. So great. You seem to have responded to Ben. He says, thanks. So Gregory says, thanks for your presentation. A question from Ottawa. Having spoken with a few people who work in the Central Bank of Canada, there's a general worry about Bitcoin in particular. The Central Bank of Nigeria just restated its banking ban on digital currencies, cryptocurrencies, even to shut down all bank accounts affiliated with exchanges. Many Canadians don't trust doing finance on their mobile devices, even while they do online banking on laptops. When do you predict the majority of nations in the G20 will use CBDCs?
Okay, so there are many things to comment in here. I mean, first of all, well, yes, cryptocurrencies are of course a concern to many people and many banks because, well, first of all, because this idea of lack of control, which is of course worrying, no? I mean, to banks and some people, and secondly, because it's been growing a lot lately. I mean, there was that surge in the price of Bitcoin 3 years ago, but then it went down again. It looked like it was something that was going to be like cyclical, but then we are seeing now cryptocurrencies going up and up, and it looks like this time there's actually been a change in here because it's not just about people buying and selling cryptos, but we are seeing institutional investors tapping into this market. I mean, we saw well, PayPal allowing crypto transactions in the US. We saw MasterCard recently announcing that it's going to support cryptos as well. We saw Tesla, of course, investing that much in Bitcoin in January. We saw DBS in Singapore, the big bank, creating a crypto exchange. So institutional investors are starting to tap into this market as well. And this, of course, might be worrying for others because cryptocurrencies have some issues now when it comes to compliance, financial crime. I'm not saying that cryptocurrencies are used for shady purposes because, I mean, I read a study which said recently that even though initially 30% of crypto-related transactions were shady, right now this amount only is something like around 0.04%. So, I mean, we cannot like assume that just because someone or some company uses crypto there needs to be something wrong. Actually, I mean, there isn't, but it's worrying. I mean, that's for sure. It's worrying to traditional banks, to central banks. You mentioned Nigeria. That's true. India as well. It looks like India is going to ban cryptocurrencies as well. China, as I said before, adopted a very tough stance towards cryptocurrencies too. Singapore is the opposite. Singapore is probably one of the most crypto-friendly places in the world. Whereas, for example, Hong Kong is about to adopt a new legislation, which is it's not as harsh as China's one, but it's basically excluding retail investors from investing in crypto. So as we can see, there's a lot of movement going on in each country, and well, I guess these coming years we are going to see many more governments being harsh on cryptos, while some others are going to be much more lenient. It's going to depend on each government, and I think there is no right or wrong solution. I think though that people shouldn't be scared about cryptos in the sense that the cryptos that we see today are not the cryptos that we saw like maybe 10 years ago. Where just a few group of people like bought and sold cryptos, and those people, as I said before, statistically speaking, maybe there were more people using it for bad purposes than now. Now there's been a change. I mean, many more like normal people, institutional investors are tapping into this market, which, I mean, as an investment, it's undeniable that it's offering like many opportunities, because, I mean, if we look at the surge in the price of Bitcoin, well, it's been a huge surge. You asked me as well that you told me that many Canadians don't trust in finance on their mobile devices, even though they do so on laptops. Yes, I mean, that's why I said before that the penetration of CBDC, same as virtual banking, it's going pretty much to depend on the, not only on central banks, but also on the mentality of the citizens of each country. I mean, in China, people are already like using cell phones for making payments like very often, whilst in Japan, it's not like that. So if you tell me that I wasn't aware that people in Canada trusted laptops more than mobile devices, but that, of course, might be a problem for rolling out the CBDC, of course. You also asked me, when do I predict that the majority of nations in the G20 are going to use CBDCs? Well, it's hard to say, but I think it's going to take a long while, because aside from China, most of our countries are much less advanced. And even if they start using CBDCs, CBDCs are not designed to replace physical coins and notes. So in China, one of the consequences of digital yuan might be so, but it's also because people seldom use banknotes and coins as of today. So that's why it's like a natural evolution that's already happening. While, for example, in Canada, Europe, I see the future CBDC is more like a alternative means of payment, and like a backup plan, if we want to put it this way, rather than a new element designed to completely replace physical coins and notes. So it's hard to say, but it's going to take many years before most G20 countries use CBDCs. And I mean, it remains to be seen, because maybe we will never see all of them rolling out a CBDC, because they might not find it like useful. So it's hard to say.
Well, thank you so much for taking all these questions, and thank you, participants, for your excellent questions. I myself have many, many more questions I'd love to ask you about, Oriol, but for now we have to leave it at that, because we've reached the top of the hour and we have to let you go. So our sincere thanks for taking the time today to give us this overview. It's been really, really informative and fantastic to have your perspective on things. I just want to remind participants and also invite all of you and you as well, Oriol. We will be on from June 1st to June 4th having the Blockchain Technology Symposium. And June 1st, we have an entire day devoted to decentralized finance, which will include the topic of CBDCs. We do have a call for proposals out, and I will post this, I think, let me just post this in the chat for all participants to see. I'll just make sure that panelists and attendees can see this. The link here to the information about the Blockchain Technology Symposium. The call for proposal link is on that site for anyone who is interested. I would love to see this conversation be carried forward. There's so much to unpick here, and we are really at the cusp of some very momentous and exciting developments. So thank you all again. Thank you, Oriol, for your wonderful presentation today. Really delighted to have you, and thanks so much for sharing your insights. So we'll see you all next time, and we will be next month having Dr. Joseph Bono will join us for a presentation. So do join us again for the next Blockchain at UBC Monthly Research Talk. Thanks again, Oriol. Goodbye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
See you soon.